With this story, as with all the other stories I tell, I'm trying to do something particular to my beliefs, my style, and my interests. In this novel, I wanted to do two things. One was to address a contemporary political issue. I wrote the novel after the attacks of 9/11, when relations between the Muslim and the Christian world suddenly took a dramatic turn for the worse. Catherine of Aragon's parents were the princes of Spain who drove the Muslims out of Spain and created a kingdom of intolerance against Muslims and Jews. It seemed to me really interesting and worthwhile to write about the kingdom of tolerance and multiculturalism that they had destroyed. So the account of Catherine's childhood describes very richly the high culture and civilization of the Spain of her childhood, and quotes in translation Arabic poetry of the time. I described the palace of her childhood, and in later life in England I imagined her sending for a Moorish doctor, the only culture then in Europe which had universities studying natural sciences. I used the vehicle of the historical novel, set in the Tudor period, to pass comment on our own times. To me, just because it's a historical novel doesn't mean that it should be escapist. More than this, I think it can contribute to the debates of today. The other thing I wanted to do was to restore Catherine of Aragon in the historical record as a young woman, as a woman who had a dramatic and significant impact on the events of her country. The great curse of the historian, hindsight, is because all historians know that Catherine ends up abandoned, ill, old, separated from her daughter and from those that love her. She's always written about with a sort of elegiac sorrow. She's history's older woman. But of course, instead of thinking about her as a victim, writing with the knowledge of the end of her story, if one told the story as it unfolded, especially as if it was set at the time when she ruled in England herself, one would write a very different sort of novel. Here, to conclude, is a comparison, two ways of describing exactly the same scene. When Catherine of Aragon first came to England to marry Prince Arthur, she stayed at Dogmersfield Palace in Hampshire. And following the chivalric tradition of surprising the bride with a romantic dash to see her, and wanting to see the Spanish princess who had cost him so much, Henry VII and his son Arthur rode south from London to meet her. Her ambassador, Pedro de Ayala, explained to Henry VII that she could not be seen. Her duenna tried to hold the door, but the young princess overruled them both. We know of this because of the ambassador's report to her parents, which told them of the incident. And of course, we have to remember his report was also a crafted narrative. No document is entirely innocent. The Virgin Widow, Jean Plaidy, 1961. Catherine was sitting with her maids of honour when they heard the commotion from the hall below. It had been too miserable a day for them to leave the bishop's palace, and it had been decided that they should remain there until the rain stopped. Elvira burst on them, and never had Catherine seen her so agitated. "The king is below," she said, and never had Catherine seen her in such alarm. Catherine stood up. "He insists on seeing you. He declares he will see you. I cannot imagine what their highnesses will say when this reaches their ears." "But does not the King of England know of my parents' wishes? It would seem that there is only one person whose wishes are considered in this place, and that is the King of England. What is happening below? The Count of Cabra is telling the king that you are not to be seen till after the wedding, and the king is saying that he will not wait." "Then there is only one thing to be done," said Catherine quietly. "This is England, and when we are in England we must obey the king. Let there be no more protests. We must forget our own customs and learn theirs. Let it be known that I am ready to receive the king." Elvira stared at her in astonishment. In that moment Catherine looked very like her mother, and it was as impossible for Elvira to disobey her as it would have been to disobey Isabella of Castile. I draw your attention to a few features of this writing. The focus of the piece is the deference to Catherine, to her judgment, and to her hereditary authority. The duenna, a lady, but not a royal lady, is mistaken and ill-judging compared to the grace and wisdom of her young charge, a royal princess. I think this is part of the deferential view towards monarchy which was very typical of England in the 1960s. It's also written very formally. Again, I think this is an issue of deference, as if the author is talking about important people in the important past. I think if one were to read the novel, you could date it at once as a work of the 1950s, 1960s. My version of the scene draws on exactly the same historical record, but it's different. The writing's more lively, there's more physical action, the scene at the door is enacted, not proposed. There's comedy in there with the mistaken identity of the king, and the immediacy of the description gives us a sense of the character of both the king and the duenna as people determined to have their own way. We even get a physical description of Henry VII slid into this scene. It's realistic and comedic writing, much more typical of the 21st century, with its lack of deference and its liveliness. You'll have your own thoughts about what style you prefer. My point is just to suggest that writing reveals the times of its creation. Even a historical novel, set in the Tudor period, based on Tudor documents, will reveal, probably in every line, another period as well, that of the author. The Constant Princess, Philippa Gregory, 2005. I say you cannot come in. If you were the King of England himself, you could not come in. I am the King of England, Henry Tudor said without a flicker of amusement, and she can either come out right now, or I damned well will come in, and my son will follow me. The Infanta has already sent word to the king that she cannot see him, the duenna said witheringly. The nobleman of her court rode out to explain to him that she is in seclusion, a lady of Spain. Do you think that the King of England would come riding down the road when the Infanta herself has refused to see him? What sort of a man do you think he is? Exactly like this one, he said, and thrust his fist with the great gold ring into her face. The Count de Cabra came into the hall in a rush and at once recognised the lean, 40-year-old man, threatening the Infanta's duenna with a clenched fist, a few aghast servitors behind him, and gasped, "The king!" At the same moment, the duenna recognised the new badge of England, the combined roses of York and Lancaster, and recoiled. The Count skidded to a halt and threw himself into a low bow. "The king!" he hissed, his voice muffled by speaking with his head on his knees. The duenna gave a little gasp of horror and dropped into a deep curtsy. "Get up," the king said, "and fetch her." Thank you very much.